unbeatable.
What's going on, you guys? It's your boy Sodium285 and welcome to part 2 of my ultimate ranking of all 80 Marvel movies I've seen. I already did the first part, which are the bottom 20. Be sure you check that out before you watch this. And remember, my list isn't the right list, it's just my personal list. We're both going to disagree and that's perfectly fine. And especially since these next 20, some of them are what you consider some of the worst superhero films of all time, but also some of the best superhero films of all time. But it's just my opinion. With that said, let's get started. So bringing us into the top 60 is Next Avengers Heroes of Tomorrow. This one ended up being a pleasant surprise for me because I didn't have the highest expectations for this one, but it ended up being a fun what if Marvel movie. What if the Avengers had kids, where they got defeated by Ultron and the kids have to step up and save the world. Now, because of this, it feels like a sequel to a movie that never happened, so you don't really know the OG Avengers, who they were in terms of personality, so you don't connect with them too much. But at least you have Iron Man and Hulk still alive, so you connect with them, and the protagonists, as in the kids, are actually pretty compelling. I enjoyed them. So Next Avengers Heroes of Tomorrow might not be a top tier Marvel film, but it is a middle of the road Marvel film that is a fun watch. Coming in at number 59 is The New Mutants. Now, I think this is a movie that has been overhated in these past 3 years. Now, it may not be anything great or anything to write home about. I mean, the Fox X-Men films were pretty much done by this point, forgotten, and people were looking forward to moving on to what the X-Men have in the MCU next. But I think The New Mutants is just a nice, decent film. I think the story is quite fine about these different mutants who have powers that are quite out of control, especially our main lead. But at the same time, I feel like it took a few steps back, because at this point superhero films had become a bit more colorful, willing to have more vibrant costumes, and some of the X-Men films prior to this did. This felt more like a throwback to a lot of those earlier X-Men films where they weren't really about colorful costumes. But I think the nice story as well as the good acting was something that made this film interesting for me. And I think it gets a bit too much hate. It's a nice C-tier movie, it's a decent movie. Number 58, Spider-Man 3. This is another movie that I think has been overhated, and sure, nostalgia might have a hand in this, as like I said with Spider-Man 2, I grew up with the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films. They are what made me the huge Spider-Man fan I am today. But Spider-Man 3 in particular has a special place in my heart because it was actually my favorite of the trilogy as a kid. It will be the one I'd rewatch the most and quote the most. Obviously, as an adult and watching it more recently, I can definitely see the flaws and see why there's a lot of criticism, and I can understand some of them. It did try to do too many villains at once, and it often looked like as if it was switching between them a lot, and I felt Gwen Stacy honestly had no purpose being in this film. And the way both Eddie Brock and the Venom symbiote were introduced felt very lazy. Why not use the astronaut guy from Spider-Man 2? You barely used him in that film, so why not use him here? Anyway, but I do think there are things that put this above all the movies that I have ranked lower. For starters, while I can acknowledge that Spider-Man 2 might be the better made film, Spider-Man 3, in my opinion, is the more enjoyable film. And honestly, stuff like Emo Peter is so stupid, it's actually kind of funny, and I have a good laugh watching it, even if it's unintentionally funny. So it's still very enjoyable. Plus, even though you have multiple villains, they're brought together by the theme of forgiveness that this film was going for. Sure, Peter and Mary Jane are still very insufferable together, but maybe not as much as they were in Spider-Man 2, even though Mary Jane is still a terrible character in this trilogy. So, look, I can't say that Spider-Man 3 is a great film. At best, it's decent, but I'm never bored, it still makes me laugh, and I still have a good time watching it. Next up is Blade. Like I said before, I'm not as high on these Blade movies as I know a lot of you are, but I can acknowledge that this first Blade movie is a decent one. First off, it's well made. Second, it did try and take itself a bit more seriously compared to other comic book movies at the time. Look at you, Ninja Turtles 3. And I will say, it did give a horror edge to the genre, even though I'm not the biggest fan of horror. But the reason also why Blade isn't high for me is also because I wasn't really invested in the story until the second half. But I do think that it's a nice, quieter film, especially compared to the other two Blade films. And I think the supporting characters are interesting. Honestly, if this was the only Blade film, I think I would have been fine with that. Wesley Snipes giving his all, and I enjoyed the supporting girl, the main character girl, and the third act battle, not bad. So Blade, not my favorite, but it's decent. Number 56, Werewolf by Night. If you saw my video I had made about Phase 4 and Phase 2 of the MCU, you probably are aware that I'm not the biggest fan of this one. Again, because horror is not something I enjoy. But I do appreciate what it was doing. I think it has a good aesthetic vibe to it. I enjoy the visual effects. But other than that, I do not really have strong feelings towards Werewolf by Night. I wasn't invested in the story or the characters, but it's a decent watch. It's a decent 55 minutes. So, not terrible, just not great, not one of my favorites, even though I know for a fact it will be a lot of people's favorite. 55, Eternals. This is a pretty frustrating one for me because I think Eternals has a lot of high highs, but there are some issues that hold it back. Because this movie is absolutely beautiful, it's very stunning to look at, and Chloe Zhao's directing is really good, and the acting is top tier, and especially Gemma Chan, Richard Madden, Angelina Jolie. But I think the actual story, it tried to do too much. You were introducing 10 new characters all at once, so the development to each one and you getting to know each one felt a little uneven, and the focus on it was a bit all over the place. Either way, this is a movie that I've liked a little bit more since the last time I talked about it, so I can see this getting higher. It's just not one I don't think I'll love anytime soon or ever, but I do want to like it slightly more. Maybe an Eternal sequel can bump it up, but for now, it's decent. Number 54, Elektra. Out of all of the controversial takes I've ever had in my life, possibly the most controversial is that I think Elektra is a very overhated film, and I don't think it deserves to be called one of the worst comic book movies ever made. I actually think this is a decent, solid C+ movie. So before you all grab your pitchforks and torches, at least hear me out real quick. I actually thought that this was a major improvement over the Daredevil film that came out 2 years prior that I already talked about. And that isn't even an understatement. So many things were improved. From the acting to the directing to even the storytelling. I actually think this is a much tighter and more streamlined story. And I was actually invested and it kept my attention. It wasn't boring. Plus, this was a better showcase of Jennifer Gardner's acting talents. It was consistent with its tone. And I think there was a good amount of emotion. Now, do I think that a lot of the comic booky supernatural elements feel out of place and unexplained? Absolutely. But it doesn't take away from the rest of the film. Well, it definitely holds it back a little, well actually a lot, but it doesn't take away from the rest of the film, which I actually think is pretty solid. So I think if you watch this movie on its own terms, you might begin to appreciate this more. Now, do I think a certain movie that came out 12 years after this does everything this movie does, but better? Absolutely. But I appreciate what Elektra tried to do, and I don't think it deserves nearly as much hate as it gets. Number 53, Doctor Strange the Sorcerer Supreme. This is a tricky one to rank because I think it tells the origins of Doctor Strange really well as going into his backstory on how he failed to save his sister from a disease. I think that was very compelling and very interesting, but I also think a lot of the stuff with the Sorcerer Supreme, the Ancient One and whatnot, and Dormammu wasn't as compelling as I may have hoped it would be. Either way, this is still a very decent, pretty good animated film that I think you should definitely give a shot. I think it has a consistent tone and a good psychological exploration of Stephen Strange. It's just not one I'd rewatch a lot. That's why it's lower on my list. And that will bring us to Hulk. Another movie that I think has been overwhelmingly hated and made fun of. Now, these were the early days where Marvel movies were actually being good, so you could tell they were still trying to find their footing and being a bit more experimental. And it doesn't get more experimental than with Ang Lee's Hulk. The director, Ang Lee, set out to tell a bit more of a psychological story about Bruce Banner, and I think he did a solid job here. I actually enjoyed this one. Whether you're talking about the performances, I think Eric Bana is actually quite underrated as Bruce Banner. He may not be my favorite, that would be Mark Ruffalo, but I enjoyed his performance a lot and I think he gave it his all, especially in the psychological aspect of the character. The faces, the expression, the emotion is really good. Jennifer Connelly is an easy standout. How much care she shows for Bruce and how well written her Betty Ross is. And I enjoy Sam Elliott, and I enjoyed the father-son story where it dealt with suppressed memories and psychological trauma. And yes, I actually don't mind the Hulk dogs and space clouds. I actually thought the Hulk dogs in particular were actually, whoa, that is terrifying. Who knows what David Banner is capable of. Sure, the pacing I think is a bit slow. I think they could have either cut down or streamlined it a bit more so that it doesn't feel too long. And sure, the comic book panel transitions work less than most of the time, but I think Hulk is a solid film, and if you watch this movie on its own terms, I think you, again like Elektra, you'll appreciate it for what it is, because that's what I do. Number 51, The Incredible Hulk. Yeah, as you can see, I think these two Hulk films are very much on par with each other, and I actually have a lot of back and forth on which one I actually prefer. I think they both have strengths and weaknesses over each other. On the one hand, I think The Incredible Hulk is a much better paced film than Ang Lee's Hulk, to the point, especially because it has a shorter runtime. It doesn't feel like it might get boring, even if I think the story of Ang Lee's Hulk is still investing for me. But on the other hand, I think the characterization and storytelling might be a little on the weaker side of The Incredible Hulk. It still has that enjoyment factor. I think a lot of the performances and special effects still hold up. Edward Norton, very good as Bruce Banner. Liv Tyler, kind of underrated as Betty Ross. William Hurt, may he rest in peace, very good as Thunderbolt Ross. But I don't think the movie gives you a good sense on who Bruce Banner is in terms of his personality. It's always him looking for a cure, which is a compelling story, but it often involves a lot of chase scenes and whatnot. And I actually think the third act battle with Abomination is overrated. It's not necessarily bad, it just lasts for a bit too long, that it drags the film's pacing down. And I'm at the point where I'm like, the punches aren't working, try something else. So look, The Incredible Hulk is not bad, it's still a good film, it's just not great, and I don't think it's as underrated as people make it out to be. I would actually describe it as a bit overprotected at this point. Starting off the top 50 is The Punisher from 2004. To be honest, I can actually see this one getting higher on my list in the future because I really enjoyed this one. I think it's possibly the most human of the Punisher movies. Sure, the opening where Frank Castle is an undercover FBI agent pretending to be a Russian is a little weird and I was a little confused, but after that, it's actually pretty solid. The family stuff gives you a good sense on who Frank Castle is in terms of his personality, and I enjoyed his scenes with his wife, his son, and his father. I think they were great and were a good way of establishing his relationships with them, to the point where after his enemies start killing everyone in his family, you feel for him, and his turn and his downfall is quite tragic. And I think the cast is absolutely fantastic. Whether you're talking about Thomas Jane as Frank Castle, I think he gives a very good performance, or Rebecca Romijn as Joan, his neighbor, I think that was really good, and I really like the supporting characters, the neighbors in particular. I think this was a very good film that had a very middle ground between being violent but also fun, and I honestly enjoyed The Punisher. I actually think it's a shame that we didn't get a sequel from this, but either way, I'm still happy with Punisher 2004. Number 49, Ultimate Avengers the movie. I think that this is a very enjoyable animated Avengers movie. I think it starts out well, telling Captain America's origins on how he got frozen in the ice and ended up in present day really well. But after that, I will say it slows down and becomes a little drab. But then in the second half, it picks up. And the second half is really what makes this movie ultimate. Because I will say, I really enjoyed the setup of Bruce Banner in the first half, and you can understand why he doesn't Hulk up until the second half. I thought some of the characterization of Hank Pym was a little off, and even maybe Janet Van Dyne. But other than that, I think the Avengers, Ultimate Avengers, is a very solid animated version of the Avengers. Coming in at number 48 is Doctor Strange. If you're familiar with my MCU videos, you know that Doctor Strange used to be my least favorite MCU movie. But as you can tell, time has made me appreciate the movie more. I still have my issues, but I do appreciate it more. I think the acting is really good, especially Benedict Cumberbatch and Tilda Swinton. And I think the visual effects are amazing. And I really enjoyed the third act with Dormammu. That is something I've always found funny. Dormammu? I've come to bargain. I've always enjoyed that. But I feel the pacing might have slowed it, hence why I wasn't invested in the origin too much, which is a shame. I think the fight scenes are done pretty well. Matt Mikkelsen, though, wasn't really interesting. And Stephen Strange was maybe a bit unlikable to the point where I was actually rooting against him at one point. And I didn't really know why Christine was there, which is a shame because Rachel McAdams is a good actress. Again, I think the first Doctor Strange is a good movie. I just don't think it's that great, unfortunately. Number 47, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Now, before Eternals, I consider this to be the most polarizing and divisive film in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. You have a bunch of people who absolutely love it, but you also have a bunch of people who strongly dislike it. For me, it's absolutely the most frustrating film in the entire MCU, especially after Volume 3, because for every positive, I actually have a bit of a negative, and over time I've ended up liking it slightly less, which is a shame because I liked it a lot the first time. It was top 15 favorite MCU films, but again, over time I've liked it less to the point where I consider it a low tier MCU film. Because on the one hand, I really love the soundtrack, I love Baby Groot, I love Gamora, I think she's an absolute badass and Zoe Saldana steals every scene she's in, and I like the relationship between Peter and Gamora. I think that is very compelling, and I guess what James Gunn was going for with this film of fathers and sons, how you find family outside of biology, that question. I'm just not sure about the execution. For one, the plot starts because Rocket stole batteries from the Sovereign because he wanted to. I don't care if they were easy to steal, you don't make an enemy out of each other. And when I see Rocket doing that, I'm thinking to myself,
I'm surrounded by idiots.
Drax was also kind of annoying. There wasn't enough to go off on Mantis, which is a shame after both Volume 3 and the holiday special. Star-Lord can be kind of an idiot at times, and I felt the Ravengers were a bit forced in, and Yondu's death, I want to say, still impacts me, but the more I think about it, the more I think it works less, because we never got the sense that Star-Lord and Yondu were close. I always got the sense that Yondu was kind of using him and threatening him. So it kind of comes a bit out of nowhere, which is a shame because James Gunn wanted that to be an emotional death, and I want to believe that it's still emotional somewhere. I think there is still a good movie in here. In fact, I would still say at the very least it's a good film. It's a fun watch, but I don't think it's great, and I actually describe this as the most overprotected film in the MCU. Number 46, X-Men Origins Wolverine. Now this has been labeled as one of the worst comic book movies of all time, so probably seeing this movie in somewhere in the middle of my ranking is making you go, "You're insane!" A lot of people have claimed that this is a movie that nobody in their right mind should like. Need I remind you that some of these same people have also admitted that they like either Ninja Turtles 3, Venom Let There Be Carnage, and Batman v Superman. And those are movies that I can't see anybody in their right mind liking. So, welcome to equality. But honestly, I actually like X-Men Origins Wolverine. And look, it does have its problems. I think the CGI is very rubbery, and I'm not going to defend what they did to Deadpool in this movie. That is a disgrace. And I would actually describe this as a bad film if this was a Deadpool film for that alone. But it's not a Deadpool film, it's a Wolverine film. And I think a lot of the Wolverine stuff in this film was actually pretty strong. Hugh Jackman is great as always as Wolverine, and I actually didn't mind his romantic relationship with Silver Fox. Some people say it was forced, but honestly, I thought it was a major step up from the Wolverine-Jean Grey relationship of the trilogy. Honestly, I didn't buy into that relationship, so Silver Fox I thought was a major step up, and I felt for Wolverine. I felt sorry when he lost his memory at the end, and I think the action is handled decently, and it's a fun watch with its quick pace, and it's fun. I enjoy it, so I think maybe you guys might want to give it a bit of another chance. I'm not trying to brainwash anyone, make people change their minds on this film. Maybe watch it from a different perspective. Number 45, X-Men The Last Stand. Another movie that I think has been overhated, because look, this movie isn't perfect. Like I said, I think it botched the Phoenix Saga, I completely agree there, but I think it has much more goodwill than Dark Phoenix does, because it has more than enough to make up for it. For starters, I think the action and the performance are still very top notch, especially Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. I'd argue this is the best Halle Berry has been as Storm, and I enjoyed Iceman and Rogue a lot in this film. As well as that, while the B-plot, the Phoenix story, was completely botched, the A-plot, the Mutant Cure, I thought was really good. While not told perfectly, I really liked the driving force for the film, and I think it's a fun watch, and honestly, I think X-Men The Last Stand is overhated. I have fun watching it. 44, Ultimate Avengers 2, Rise of the Panther. This is one of those rare sequels that very much improves on the first movie. While I enjoyed the first Ultimate Avengers movie, I did think the first half, or the majority of the first half, kind of dragged it down and felt a little slow, even if it was still somewhat interesting. I think both halves of Ultimate Avengers 2 is very exciting. I also really liked how well it tells Black Panther's origin and how it gets the dynamic between him and Captain America right. I also like the involvement of each of the other Avengers, and it feels like a true ensemble film. And I have to say, I think Hank Pym is actually a bit more redeemable in this one. I do think Thor is a little redundant like he was in the first film, but other than that, I very much enjoyed this film, and I did like the sacrifice Hank Pym made at the end. So I would say this is a win for the animated Marvel movies. Number 43, For the Dark World. Now, I've said in the past that I think that this movie is a tad bit overhated, and I still stand by that. But with that said, I think most of us can agree that yeah, it's not great and is a low-tier MCU film. And make no mistake, there are positives, hence why I still say I like this film. I still think it's good, but again, it's not great, and I do understand some of the criticisms people throw at this, and I do share some of them. That's why it doesn't crack the top 5 most overhated MCU movies. For one, even though I really like the action in this film, I think there might have been a bit too much action to cover up the fact that the story isn't as strong as it was in the first film. And again, Malekith is an absolute poor villain who's actually shockingly forgettable. And I think some of the relationships and supporting characters were a little wasted. I did like Frigga's sacrifice and the Thor Loki dynamic. I think all of the performances are still top notch. I will say though, I think I would have actually had this movie lower on my list if I had enjoyed the Wonder Woman movies, because as we know, the director of the Wonder Woman movies, Patty Jenkins, was actually supposed to direct this film, but then got dropped over creative differences. Now, it was said that she had planned for a Romeo-Juliet vibe for the Dark World, which I think was well in line with what Kenneth Branagh had done with the first Thor film, the Shakespearean rom-com. However, I don't think she would have executed it too well. after seeing her Wonder Woman films, which honestly, the first Wonder Woman I thought was decent but overrated and kind of disappointing. And Wonder Woman 1984, look, I don't hate it like a lot of people do, but let's face it, it's not good.
And Steve's return crossed more than one line.
After seeing how Patty Jenkins kind of made Diana a little whiny in the first Wonder Woman film and a bit of a rapist in the second Wonder Woman film, maybe it was for the best that she didn't direct The Dark World after all, because at the end of the day what we got was a good movie, even if it's just not great. Number 42, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Another extremely divisive film in the entire MCU, and I was a little worried when they had announced that Sam Raimi was going to direct this film because I wasn't as high on what he did with Spider-Man in the sequels as you've seen. I didn't hate the sequels at all. I actually kind of defended Spider-Man 3, but again, Sony kind of reined him in on that one. But I wasn't sure, and especially when they were saying he was gonna make it a horror film, and I was not looking forward to having him make Elizabeth Olsen scream all the time. But that is not the film we got. Maybe Kevin Feige reined Raimi in, and I actually thought this was an improvement over the first Doctor Strange. I think the comedy, surprisingly, was better than the first Doctor Strange. I found the story more interesting, the characters more likable and interesting, and even Christine had cooler stuff to do in this film than she did in the last film. Sure, there isn't as much multiversal madness as many people might have wanted, but I think this Doctor Strange film is a step in the right direction. Plus, I found Scarlet Witch to be a more understanding villain than Matt Mikkelsen and Dormammu in the previous film. So, I'm actually, despite not being a big Sam Raimi fan, in the camp that I prefer the second Doctor Strange over the first. And finally, in number 41 is Spider-Man. Out of the 3 Spider-Man films that were a big part of my childhood, I think this first one, is the one that holds up the best. And this is a tricky one to rank because I really enjoyed the origin story that Spider-Man goes through, but I do think it falters a little in the third act. Not necessarily because of the special effects or the action sequences. I actually think when Spider-Man is holding the gondola and Mary Jane is an iconic shot on it in its own right, but more so to do with the fact that Peter lets the Green Goblin die and refuses to help him, saying, "I already have a father, his name is Ben Parker," which goes against the fact that this Peter Parker is honoring his uncle's principles. That was the lesson this Peter Parker learned. But with all that in mind, I still very much enjoyed this film. Plus, Willem Dafoe is a ton of fun as Norman Osborn and even as the Green Goblin. Enough said about J.K. Simmons. This is the most tolerable Kirsten Dunst's Mary Jane has been. The rest of the cast is fantastic, whether you talk about James Franco or Rosemary Harris. And Tobey Maguire, while I'm not the biggest fan of him as Spider-Man, he's very good as Peter Parker. So with that said, while this is not a perfect film, I still very much enjoyed the first Spider-Man and I think it's iconic. So there you have it, true believers. That is part 2 of my ranking of all 80 Marvel movies that I've seen. Let me know in the comment section what your ranking of the next 20 are. Do you like my list? Do you hate my list? I know there's a lot of controversy because you think some of these are some of the best Marvel movies of all time, but also some of the worst Marvel movies of all time. But whatever it is, let me know. And if you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe for more if you enjoy my content. I talk Marvel, Ninja Turtles, Sonic the Hedgehog, Power Rangers, Percy Jackson, sometimes DC and Mario. So if any of that is up your alley, this is the place for you. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll be back with part 3 very soon. Until then, trust your own judgment. Sodium285, out.
If the world chooses to become my enemy, I will fight like I always have.